The sun was sinking behind the dunes when my car sputtered for the last time and fell silent. The air was thick and dry, every breath scratching my throat as I looked around at the endless desert. There was no signal, no road, only sand stretching into gold and rust shades. I waited for a while, hoping another vehicle might pass, but nothing moved except the wind. As the light faded, a small shape appeared in the distance, a flicker of smoke rising faintly into the sky. It was the only sign of life in miles, so I started walking toward it, each step sinking deeper into the hot dust. By the time I reached the source, darkness had already begun to spread. A small hut stood against the wind, built from clay and wood, with a faint orange glow coming from inside. I hesitated before knocking, unsure what kind of person might live here in the middle of nowhere. The door opened quietly, and a tall African man appeared, his face calm, his eyes deep but unreadable. He said something softly in a language I couldn't understand, then motioned for me to come in. I nodded and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that greeted me. The room smelled of earth and firewood. There was almost nothing in it, just a mat on the floor, a few clay pots, and a small flame flickering in the corner. The man handed me a tin cup filled with water. I drank slowly, the coolness shocking against my dry mouth. He watched me for a moment and then went back to stirring something in a pot. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt strangely peaceful after hours of walking in the wind. When he finally spoke in broken English, his voice was low and steady. He asked where I had come from and why I was alone. I explained about the car, how it had broken down and left me stranded. He nodded, as though this sort of thing happened all the time, then said only one word, "Stay." He placed a bowl of soup in front of me, and I ate without realizing how hungry I was until that moment. Every mouthful felt like warmth returning to my body. Outside, the wind began to howl, carrying sand against the sides of the hut. He stepped out to secure the door with a wooden bar, then returned and sat near the fire. For a while, neither of us spoke. I could hear the storm getting stronger, grains of sand scraping against the clay walls like whispering voices. He looked up once, his gaze catching mine across the dim light. There was no expression on his face, only quiet focus, but something in the air shifted, a shared awareness that neither of us tried to name. He pointed to a mat beside the fire and gestured that I could rest there. I lay down, wrapping my jacket around me, but I couldn't sleep. The firelight danced across the walls, and the sound of the storm became a steady rhythm. I watched him move around the small room, tending to the fire, his figure outlined in amber light. Everything about the moment felt unreal, like I had stepped out of my old life and into another world, one stripped of noise, people, and rules. At one point, he sat down again, not far from where I was lying. I could feel his presence close by, strong and still. The smell of smoke and earth filled the room. I wanted to thank him again, to say something about how strange it felt to be safe in such a lonely place, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just looked at the flames, my thoughts quieting until all that was left was the soft sound of the wind and the slow, calm rhythm of his breathing beside me. When I finally closed my eyes, the storm outside had reached its peak. The sand hit the walls like rain, and somewhere beneath that wild noise, I could hear the steady heartbeat of the desert itself. I didn't know then that the night ahead would change me, that a stranger in a forgotten place could make me question everything I thought I understood about solitude, about connection, about myself. The storm raged through the night, howling like an animal searching for something it had lost. I woke to the sound of the wind pressing against the hut and the flicker of the dying fire casting long shadows across the clay walls. The man was sitting near the door, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the flame as though guarding it from the dark. When he noticed I was awake, he gave a small nod, then poured me another cup of water. Neither of us said much. The silence between us had started to feel like a language of its own. Hours passed, the night stretching endlessly. The storm refused to calm, and the hut felt smaller with every gust. I tried to distract myself by talking. My voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. I told him about my life back home, about the city, the noise, the constant movement. I mentioned my wife, though the word felt heavy in my mouth. I spoke of the distance that had grown between us, how our conversations had turned into quiet routines, and how love had become something polite and careful. I didn't know why I was telling him any of this. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was because he listened in a way no one else had in a long time that he didn't interrupt. He just watched me, his eyes soft but searching, as if he could see past the words. When I stopped speaking, he leaned closer to the fire and said, almost to himself, that people sometimes lose their way even when they think they know the road. His English was simple, but the meaning was clear. I felt something shift inside me, a strange mixture of shame and relief. I wanted to ask about his life, so I did. He hesitated, then began to speak slowly. He told me about growing up near the edge of the desert, about a man he had loved once who left to find work in the city and never returned. His voice was steady, but the sadness in it was unmistakable. He said he stayed here because the silence of the desert was easier to live with than the silence of disappointment. His eyes reflected the firelight when he looked at me, and for a moment it felt as though the space between us dissolved. The storm outside roared louder, shaking the wooden door. He stood and added another piece of wood to the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. I watched him, every gesture quiet and certain. There was strength in the way he carried himself, but also a loneliness that mirrored my own. We turned back toward me. Our eyes met again. I couldn't look away. He sat beside me this time, closer than before. The warmth from the fire reached both of us, but it was the nearness of his body that made my chest tighten. Neither of us spoke. The air was thick, filled with the scent of smoke, dust, and something unspoken. I felt the weight of everything I'd said earlier pressing down on me. The emptiness of my marriage, the guilt, the hunger for connection. And yet, in that silence, something tender rose to the surface, something human and wordless. I didn't move, but I could feel his hand resting near mine, close enough that our fingers almost touched. My heart was pounding. The sound of the wind faded behind the pulse in my ears. For a brief moment, I forgot the world outside, the rules, the promises, the distance. There is only the warmth of the fire and the quiet understanding that we were both trying to fill the same kind of emptiness. He finally looked away, breaking whatever spell had caught us. He said quietly that the storm would end soon, and that morning would bring calm. His tone was steady, but I could hear something beneath it, a sadness that matched the one inside me. I nodded, unsure what to say. I wanted to thank him again, to tell him that his silence had given me more comfort than words ever could. Yes, the night deepened. I lay awake again, the fire burning low. I could see the outline of his face in the dim light, calm and still. I thought about my life, about the choices that had led me here, about how strange it was that a single night in a forgotten desert hut could feel more real than years of living. Somewhere between guilt and gratitude, I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, the storm still whispering its secrets against the walls. When the morning came, it arrived quietly, as if the desert itself was holding its breath after the long night. The storm had passed. Sunlight spilled through the cracks in the hut, painting lines of gold across the floor. I woke to the smell of smoke and the faint sound of something boiling. The African man was already up, tending to a small pot near the fire. His movements were slow and calm, the same steady rhythm as before. For a moment, I just watched him. The world outside was silent again. No wind, no chaos, only the soft hum of the early day. I felt a strange heaviness in my chest, the kind that comes when something important has ended, but hasn't quite left you. He noticed me awake and gave a small nod, sliding a tin cup of tea toward me. The warmth of the cup felt grounding in my hands. Neither of us spoke at first. The words I might have said about gratitude, confusion, or guilt felt too fragile in the quiet. Instead, we sat there in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the dunes. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, almost as if he didn't want to disturb the stillness. He said that the desert always takes something, but gives something back too. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. After finishing the tea, I stepped outside. The air was fresh, cool, and clean, carrying the faint scent of rain. The landscape stretched endlessly before me, smooth and untouched except for the faint marks of sand blown by the storm. My car sat half buried near the edge of a dune, looking small and broken. I felt a rush of helplessness until I saw him come out behind me, carrying a few simple tools. Without a word, he crouched down beside the car and began working. I joined him, though I didn't know much about engines. Together we worked in silence, our hands brushing occasionally as we tightened bolts and cleared sand from the pipes. After a long while, the car sputtered back to life, coughing out dust before settling into a rough hum. The sound felt like a heartbeat returning after too long. I turned to him, unsure how to express what I felt. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded again, wiping his hands on his shirt. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes held something. Understanding, perhaps, or farewelled. I stood there for a moment, uncertain if I should leave right away or say something more. The wind picked up lightly, stirring the edges of my clothes. Finally, I said that I would never forget his kindness. He looked at me and said, "Sometimes kindness is all we have." His voice was simple, but it carried the weight of truth. I wanted to ask if I'd ever see him again, but I knew the answer. The desert keeps its stories hidden. It doesn't give them back easily. So I only nodded and got into the car. The engine trembled but held steady as I turned it toward the horizon. When I looked in the mirror, he was still standing there outside the hut, a lone figure against the vast sea of sand. As the distance grew, the hut became smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the desert. The road ahead was long and empty. I drove in silence, feeling the sun rising higher behind me. But inside, something had shifted, a quiet awareness that the night in that hut wasn't about betrayal or sin. It was about something deeper, something that didn't fit into words. For years, I had carried loneliness like a shadow, even in the middle of my marriage, even surrounded by people. But in that silence, with a stranger who asked for nothing, I had found something close to truth. It wasn't love in the way I had known it. It was connection stripped of everything unnecessary, pure, raw, and human. By the time I reached the main road, the desert was only a memory in the mirror, yet it stayed with me. The man, the storm, the fire, all of it lives somewhere quiet inside me now. I didn't know what I would tell my wife when I returned, or if I would say anything at all. Some experiences aren't meant to be explained. Some are meant to change you quietly, without anyone noticing. Yes, the sun climbed higher and the world grew noisy again. I realized that sometimes infidelity isn't about desire. It's about finding a part of yourself that you thought the world had forgotten. And in the heart of the desert, with a man I barely knew, I had found mine.